and this is part 2 of chapter 11, and we'll start right where we left off. There are birds that arrive during the spring migration, and there are those that migrate out. The wintering greater sandhill crane and the lesser sandhill crane begin to leave the area in March. This past year, they began their migration on March 9th, with the last ones leaving on the 16th. Over 25 years ago, the last ones had left by March 22nd. The cranes are newcomers to our area. The first birds to migrate to the northern Sulphur Springs Valley of Arizona arrived in the mid-1960s. In 1970, a modest 850 wintered here. By 1986, the number had jumped to an impressive 11,000. Now, over 25,000 cranes winter in the entire valley. About 12,000 stay in the northern section of the valley. They are seen in large numbers along Whitewater Draw in the southern part of the valley and among several locations in the north at our neighboring power plant. In springtime, during their migration north, they join other migrating groups along the Platte River in Nebraska. More lately, they arrived via the Great Salt Lake in Utah. Then the migration continues north until flocks settle to nest throughout eastern Idaho, western Wyoming, southern Wyoming, as well as a few spots in Montana. The lesser sandhill cranes will nest in the Arctic tundra of eastern Siberia and northern Alaska and Canada. Although they do not nest in Arizona, there are a few records dating to the 1890s that document nests in northern Arizona. One delightful spring morning prompted me to drive to the opposite side of the valley to photograph a flock of sandhill cranes. Along with the Nikon FM camera, I carried a 200mm lens with an extender, making for an effective 400mm lens. For birders who photograph birds, 400mm is a modest medium power lens. I parked in the small open lot at a well-frequented water bird spot on the east side of the Wilcox Playa. It is a marshy area surrounded by football fields of mud. Life is made easy for the birder because there is a paved path that is raised that take you conveniently over the mud. The approach to the flock of loafing birds is hidden by low hills. Closer to the hills, I slowed my walk and easily located the flock because of their loud, persistent calls. The closer I got, the more slowly I moved, and as the hills became human-sized, I stooped until I was on my belly. I crawled to a 4-foot rise and slowly peeked above to look out upon the sea of cranes. They had just arrived to loaf and were still nervous. They hopped up and down and flapped their magnificent broad wings. Some flew to a few feet up into the air before settling again on the ground. Due to the limitations of the lens, I focused on the closest cranes, and manipulating the aperture left the majority of the flock in the background a blur of blue-gray. At times, bright sunlight showered the area, and I could broaden the depth of field, so all the cranes in the sea were in sharp focus. After an hour of observing and photographing, I needed to return to my car because my legs began to cramp. Other parts of my body began to creak from having been crouched and still for so long. I moved away slowly, but automatically rose up slightly to rub out a cramp. I did not realize, from the sandhill's perspective, I was emerging above the silhouette of the small rise. I knew soon enough, as the entire 1,000 birds began to fly in waves and then gathered to circle the area. A cacophony grew as more birds joined the expanding flock. The sound was all-encompassing, like a roaring crowd after a walk-off home run by the home team. Only it wasn't cheers I heard. It was spectacular but disturbing to know I had unnecessarily harassed the birds. The photographs remain as a testament to my endeavor, as well as the memory of my vain invasion. I am reassured, too, that the cranes have not become too accustomed to humans. On occasion, we have seen outgoing migrating birds visit our neighborhood. The first one landed in a tree next door to us and then took off again as other cranes were flying over. It is striking to see a 3-foot tall bird with a distinctive red forehead standing on a tree. During late March in 2003, we observed a crane that had landed on a pine tree about 100 yards away from our house. It looked uncomfortable sitting on top. When it joined the others, the crane was among the last ones to migrate from the area. We observed small to large flocks flying throughout winter and early spring if their yearly flight patterns bring them over our town. About once every 5 years, they appear early every morning over our town on the way to forage. Cranes flying in a flock are easily heard miles away. There is a limited repertoire of calls from the flyers. On the ground, their language includes gurgles, rolling caws, and high-pitched barks. The oldest sandhill fossils are 2.5 million years old, and our most ancient human ancestors would have heard the same or similar calls. To put it in perspective, Homo habilis, the first of the human tool makers, lived around 2.5 million years ago. Homo sapiens did not appear until 300,000 years ago. Modern humans have existed for only 1/10 of the crane's existence. When the cranes migrate in spring, we've noticed over a period of years that it is often in tandem with large spring storm systems that pass through the area. The cold weather systems move from west to east and originate from the far north near Alaska. We have theorized that either birds prefer to migrate northeast during the storms, or it is just a coincidence. Spotting them in the sky against the slate and basalt sky is often very difficult. The flocks circle high above as they prepare to migrate. The entire flock will disappear and are seen again only for a moment while they turn. If you don't catch that moment, you won't see them again. The flocks will turn in tight swirling circles, but once they organize, they continue east, elongating into V-shaped patterns. Sometimes the flocks are far away, and all I see is a V-patterned black line contrasted against the swift gray clouds. The uneven V-pattern means a few of the sand hills fly on one side of the V, while the majority forms an undulating string on the other side. Smaller flocks of about 10 birds often form a perfect V. Just as the last of the 3-foot-tall sandhill cranes are leaving the area, the arrival of one of the smallest of all bird species begins. The black-chinned hummingbird arrives in late March. From my diary, I know that 25 years ago, the males began to arrive about March 24th. 15 years ago, as well as this year, it was March 26th. 3 days after the black-chinned arrive, we can expect the arrival of the first migrating rufous and broad-tailed hummingbirds. For the rufous, our place is a stopover during their migration north, while the broadtail arrive to breed. Still, it's the male black-chinned hummingbird that arrives first. These hummingbirds are not as aggressive around the 4 hummingbird feeders as others, but a male will hold his dominance at each of the feeders. Soon the female birds arrive and the males put on a courting display with impressive high-speed, arcing U-shaped pendulum flights. I only rarely can see the flash of brilliant, nearly unnatural, iridescent purple toward magenta that otherwise is very dark. Their call is a very light zzt. These little hummingbirds are the most common for observers in Arizona and are seen in a wide variety of habitats. In the nearby Chiricahua Mountains, they are the most numerous of the hummers. They prefer areas with shade trees such as backyards, parks, and open grasslands. Generally, they are found down near here at the southeastern border with Mexico and populate along an imaginary line diagonally up to the middle of the state to the Phoenix area. They also nest as far north in Arizona as the Grand Canyon. Outside of Arizona, they are seen as far north as the state of Washington and Canada. Biologically, they are genetically close to the ruby-fronted hummingbirds that populate many areas of the United States, but not southeast Arizona. Seeing my first hummingbird was special. It was during our family road trip to the far west. In the late summer when I was 9 years old, my parents drove from Illinois to Colorado. At one Colorado restaurant, we parked and entered to have a sit-down lunch. The heavy wooden table and chairs were placed window side. I sat next to the window and we watched as ruby throats flew elegantly up to the many feeders hanging under the eaves. The capricious little birds were different from any other type of life I had seen. Their bright iridescent necks flashed in the sun, they hovered gracefully and maneuvered forward and backward millimeters at a time. It was mesmerizing. Their flying ability is unique because of their shoulder ball joint. The ball joint gives the birds the ability to, lost my camera, but they're doing the flying that is amazing. In our small town, early in the morning, the black-chinned males are among the first birds to become active because they guard each feeder. Sometimes they'll chase away females, but generally other males are chased away as a seemingly sworn enemy. There are, of course, plenty of feeder wells for any number of hummingbirds. Our 4 feeders each have 6 to 8 ports. After lapping the nectar in the feeder, one male will often land for a brief rest on a branch of a soap tree yucca. There he will preen or sit and make furtive glances, waiting to ambush the next invader. If another black-chin or broadtail arrives, the attack happens in a split second. They can be seen throughout most days, ripping past the large windows of our house, appearing as petite, high-speed balls. This spring, an American kestrel, also known as the sparrowhawk, has taken its toll on the hummingbirds. We recently observed an unsuccessful attack that was too close to call. The kestrel was perched at the top of an electric pole. It waited for one particular black-chin I had observed many times land on one particular branch of mesquite. That vertical branch has a view of 2 feeders. The hummer landed after a morning stop at the feeder under the pine tree, then as usual landed on the branch. The kestrel studied the small but oblivious bird, then dived quickly and suddenly. The bird swept over the protruding branch with its talons extended. Continuing downward, the kestrel, only 2 feet from crashing to the ground, slowed and turned as its wings formed an open hug. The wings then opened and the kestrel flew up and away. The hummingbird had escaped. Later, I saw the kestrel with a tiny bird atop another pole. It was a hummer. Others, including the one on the vertical branch, eventually disappeared. Among the local flycatchers are the tropical kingbird and the thick-billed kingbird. Both have populations that are growing in Arizona. In this town, the first to arrive are the thick-billed. Their pleasant calls before dawn continue throughout the day, and at dusk they are the last to fall silent. How have they been able to increase their population? Is it their habitat that is growing? It appears their success is due to the size of their bill. Kingbirds' bill size determines the size of the insects they eat. Differing bill sizes among species means greater diversity of insects eaten. Currently, only the yellow-breasted tropical kingbird is seen in this area to any great degree. I saw a thick-billed only once prior to this spring. The tropical and thick-billed can coexist in a localized area without competition for food because of differing bill sizes. More prevalent in other parts of Arizona are the caissons and western kingbirds, but the caissons and western do not coexist in localized areas because their bill sizes are nearly the same. The tropical kingbird, although locally more prevalent, is still rarely found in Arizona. We watch for the medium-sized bird arrival in early May. This year there was plenty of rain during winter and early spring, so the numbers of differing insect species was greater than during an average springtime. The birds build their nests in the highest trees at the very edges of our village. At least one of them found our commercial hummingbird nesting material. The material looks like a large flat packet of cotton, and it hangs in a metal cage attached to a solid outer branch of a low-lying mesquite near the bird feeder. The kingbird stuffed her bill with as much of the nesting material as possible. Large tufts hung out the sides of her bill before she flew off to pad her nest. Being of the tyrannous species, they live up to their tyrant nature. When it comes to any raptor or predatory bird flying into the village, their tenacious behavior is so typical of the species, the term for it is mobbing. And indeed, they do. If a raven flies into town, they will mob the unfortunate invader. The attackers swoop down and appear to try and peck at the neck of the raven. Some of the ravens do not appear to be harried and continue on their way out of town. Other ravens appear harassed and will sometimes veer away from town. Author-essayist Jake Page observed mobbing behavior in his neighborhood. A crow, fellow corvid to the raven, had landed in his yard and flew away with a baby bird in its beak. It was originally attacked by blue jays, and then the kingbirds roared by like a squadron of fighter planes. The kingbirds were joined by red-winged blackbirds. The crow landed, but only the kingbirds kept up their incessant attack until the crow had torn the baby bird apart and left. Jake noticed that robins took no part in any of it, and he concluded they were slackers. Ecologist Carl Safina poetically proclaims, "The arrival of spring is announced by the song of his favorite bird species." The song proclaims the arrival of red-winged blackbirds. Their song alone defines the beginning of spring. It does not matter if winter-type weather persists and it is frosty cold, or if other migrating birds have already arrived and begun their springtime songs. Nothing means spring like the song of the red-winged. My wife had long believed that to be true. Their familiar call is distinctive and well known, but complicated. It differs from other birds. The redwing sings a trilling, trilly-oo-ee-oot melody. I often encounter the song during my walk to teach at the local school. A flock of blackbirds will descend and disappear into a nearby fully leafed tree. The blackbirds maintain a low chatter. Traveling with them is a single redwing, and its call easily rose above the chatter from the rest of the flock. The red-winged only wait a short period of time before repeating its unmistakable call. Often, I can only hear the bird. As the camouflage flock becomes invisible among the thick leaves of the tree, I don't need to look for or see the bird. It is a meditative song, and I accept that. Sometimes we can see the red-winged among a flock of blackbirds, but we rarely ever see more than a few at a time in our area. Our town is located between two marshy areas that are many miles apart. Red-winged blackbird distribution in Arizona is spotty, but consistent because they breed in valleys, natural rivers, and unnatural agriculture. Although they're widespread across America, I noticed last year I had not heard any of them. I'm not the only person to notice this. A new study of songbirds concluded that they are among the most affected among declining songbird populations. Their population numbers have fallen drastically, but I'm hopeful next spring I can hear their song once more. Will future generations wish they too had a poetic invitation to spring, hearing the song of the red-winged blackbird? Among the bird species going north during spring migration from Mexico are the orioles. Tucson resident and essayist Joseph Woodcrutch once gave his impression and observation of their springtime arrival. He noticed the orioles arrived suspiciously close to the spring equinox. He concluded that if the equinox means that spring has arrived, then the arrival of Bullock, Scots, and hooded orioles puts the exclamation to it. In the high country of southeastern Arizona, they arrive during the spring equinox. One of them, the Bullock's oriole, has a dark eyeliner with a highlighted yellow-orange streak above and below the eye. They have a dark crown and distinctive white wing patch. They're found throughout the western United States, roughly from the 100th meridian westward. For a time they were considered a variant of the Baltimore oriole, but now they are considered taxonomically separate. Desert scrub is their habitat as long as it's also associated with favorable irrigated croplands. Southeastern Arizona and up into the central highlands around Prescott are their most concentrated nesting areas for Arizona. But they are found throughout the state, even high up on the Colorado Plateau near the Grand Canyon. They're sparse residents of the lower deserts in and around Yuma. They don't spend a lot of time after their arrival before beginning construction of their distinctive hanging nests expertly woven by the females. After the nesting season is over and the little ones have fledged, orioles will migrate south by the end of July. Their favorite fruit upon arrival in spring is fruit. We hang an orange in a feeder designed for the orioles. During the mating season, the males will turn a stunning yellow that, when contrasted with their large black patches, stops me in my tracks. In this area, they are often seen deep into a mesquite, clinging upside down on branches, looking for insects, and eating the profusion of blossoms that the mesquite produces. Unlike the more common curve-billed thrasher, which maintains an interest in where I am and what I'm doing on the property, the orioles seem too busy and continue their nest building and feeding efficiently with no time wasted. The white-crowned sparrow arrives in southeastern Arizona in early to mid-October. It was in October 7th when they arrived at the feeder this year. Most but not all of the sparrows exit for their migration in mid to late April, departing for their breeding grounds that extend as far north as northern Canada and Alaska. For many years, the white-crowned played the submissive role to the house sparrow for a turn on the ground under the feeder. But this past winter, the tables have turned, and the white-crowned are now dominant and far more numerous than the house sparrow. When they leave to migrate, there is a gap in the total number of birds that feed at the feeder. These birds, for which there are a few variants, have many types of calls, but I like how James Fisher described their call during his famous sojourn around North America with the legendary Roger Tory Peterson in 1953. They had arrived in California along the coast near Carmel and listened as the white-crowned sparrows, quote, wheezed their dreamy chee-chee, chitty-chitty-chee, end quote. Since then, ornithologists have determined that individual male bird songs are learned locally and not solely from their father. As a result, there are a wide variety of white-crowned sparrow dialects. Another spring visitor is the underappreciated master of the thermals in the sky. This large scavenger arrives in mid-March, about the same time as the orioles arrive during the spring equinox. Author Edward Abbey wished to be reincarnated as this bird, the turkey vulture. In his memoir, Desert Solitaire, he observed that most desert life seeks shelter and shade during the hottest part of the day. Abbey explained that all of the various desert organisms, including snakes, lizards, scorpions, mammals such as deer, coyotes, and insect life, such as ants and various other desert birds such as ravens, all shelter on a hot desert day amid the bare, rocky land. Not so for the vulture, for he observed they appear to be never in a hurry for any reason and are otherwise meditative as they float on thermals. For these birds, it looks as easy as a person walking along the ground, probably easier. He admired the vultures as they soar. They will barely maneuver a wing and then only as a slight adjustment amid the rising heat waves. During their long forays, soaring turkey vultures will use sight and smell for locating their next meal. Except for the raven, the turkey vulture has free rein in this area for carrion. It is easy to spot a turkey vulture as they fly over. I look for the familiar red crown and further to the tips of their wings, where their primaries are separated. Most birds flap and fight against gravity. Vultures do not. They cruise in thermals because caused by rising waves of heat as the hard desert ground heats faster than the air above it. I only need to look up during a blistering day while the air is cooking to watch for the only bird throughout the entire sky. Author Sam Keene compares the vulture to the garbage man. We are glad they are doing their job, but we are not too involved. He sees them as a bird mafia with waste management as their cover. He described a time when he was walking near Lake Michigan and noticed a couple of circling turkey vultures had taken an interest in a severely wounded Franklin's gull. He and his friend, on their return walk, saw that the vultures had landed near the gull and were waiting patiently. The gull appeared to know its time was limited. He could not help but notice the bald heads, and he gave an explanation for their baldness. It is an adaptation to prevent bacteria from spreading from the carcass to the vulture. The birds also urinate on their feet to kill any bacteria that may land there. During a walk the next day, the gull had already been picked over, and the bones were bleaching under the sun. The turkey vulture breeds throughout all of Arizona, but nowhere in huge numbers. Nationwide, the population of turkey vultures has gone up 10% because carrion has increased as the numbers of trucks and automobiles have increased along all types of roads. In this area, we can often see the vultures working hard at removing a carcass, no matter how humble. The common cottontail rabbit, after having darted onto a road at the exact wrong moment, will be cleaned up thoroughly, no matter how much or little of the fur and soft tissue remains. An unusual habit of vultures is worth noting. I observed the phenomenon early one spring morning as I drove the school bus through a light ground fog. The sun began to rise dimly over the Chiricahua Mountains. I noticed a flock of hulking vultures facing the sunrise. All were perched high above the road, sitting on a large cross-beamed wooden electric tower. At the moment of sunrise, several of the birds spread out their extensive wings. As the fog burned off, more birds spread their wings to dry their dew-laced wings. I was reminded of the eerie landscapes described in Bram Stoker's Victorian-era vampire novel, Dracula. It may be easy to dwell on the sinister nature of the vulture, but I prefer to focus on their extraordinary ability to hang in the sky on the thermals. There are no other birds that can match their familiarity with the lower atmosphere. They are large and ungainly on the ground and also have a hard time taking off. Their wings flap clumsily and brush the ground until lift becomes greater than gravity. Once aloft, the vulture appears graceful and more at home than on the ground. So ends the chapter. See you soon for the next one.